Hi, I'm Izzy Clarke, and as an early Christmas present, Dr. Dave offered me the opportunity to do an interview for Shrink Wrap Radio. I'll be speaking with Gary Bloom, a psychotherapist who works here in the UK. He has a private practice, but also works with a professional soccer club. Gary was originally a sports broadcaster, and he maintains his former interest alongside his new career as a psychotherapist by working both in that football club and also hosting a show on national radio here in England called On the Sporting Couch, where he speaks to elite athletes about their psychological issues. So, all that remains is for me to welcome Gary Bloom to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Lovely to be with you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. And I thought we'd start off by recapping a little bit of your first career, which might be unfamiliar to many of the audience, particularly explaining that your primary sport, I think, that you covered essentially was football, soccer. So maybe you could give us a sense of what that career was like and why and how you made the transformation into psychotherapy.
Yeah, it all feels very historic now. I was working as, I suppose, a sports commentator, sportscaster for many years, doing high European championships, soccer in the UK, and that career was sort of bumbling along quite nicely, but it left me short that I felt that something in professional sport is fantastic when you're on the inside, but even when you're on the inside, there are areas of any sports club or professional elite athletes that is just locked. It just is locked. And I always wondered what it really would be like to be on the inside. I always had a fancy of playing professional football myself, but I'd got into middle age and knew that had gone. And I just wondered what the conversations would ever sound like if I were ever able to really sit down with a sports person and really ask them what they thought about what they did. And I always had a sort of childlike fantasy of being able to have a tiny kind of impact on what I was watching. What would it be like if I was able to impact a football match I was watching? I didn't know whether that'd be possible, how it would be possible, but it was almost like a little make-believe in my head. And I suppose I never thought when I started training to be a psychotherapist that to be on the inside was ever possible. Not many people are on the inside, even to this day. There is great resistance to people like myself working in professional soccer in the UK. And it's just been an absolute privilege to get to that point. But it wasn't straightforward. It was never planned like the best laid plans of mice and men. It was a happen chance, an accident that just happened.
And so how does your working week look these days, divided between private clients and the work within the soccer club?
Well, it mixes and matches the whole time. Today, I had a professional football player come and join me in my therapy space here. I then went off and played football myself at lunchtime. I was involved with a couple of issues with the football club today. Then the first team manager came to this therapy space this afternoon. Then I had private clients interspersed with all that. So it's a complete mix and match. But a lot of my work is either sports related or has a very strong flavour of sport. Maybe academy players who are struggling. There might be players who have direct problems and able to get in their first teams, or I'm planning conferences, or I'm planning speaking engagements or writing engagements or something like that. So psychotherapy in sport is about 70 to 80% of what I do now.
I heard in one of the interviews that you've done on another podcast that you were talking about the lightning strikes in people's lives and in football clubs. So what kind of things are they that lead people to come to therapy and to seek out your help?
Yeah, the lightning strikes theory is something that was told to me by the head of the academy of the football club I was working at. And he had this theory that all of us have 5 lightning strikes a year in our lives. And they're things that are you just never, ever are going to see coming. Those that telephone call at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that news that you're not particularly well, the breakup of a relationship. It could be anything. And it's not actually, excuse me, we can't avoid those. We just can't avoid those lightning strikes. The question is, can we deal with them? How do we deal with them? And very often people, Izzy, are moving along in their lives quite nicely and everything's going okay. And then they have one of those lightning strikes. And then they realize actually something's not right here. Because they've never really been placed under a particular type of pressure or strain that needs a little bit of professional help. And hopefully that's what I would provide.
And what kind of therapies do you use? Because I think I understand that you trained in a lot of different modalities.
So I'm an integrative therapist, and that means I'm trained in all modalities. So the one that comes to mind, first of all, is something called CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, which is great when you're just beginning to work with somebody who's never been involved in therapy before, because they love to have something to take away, a bit of homework, a bit of practical advice. And I often think that CBT is almost like a clothes horse that you put in place to then hang all the heavy, wet clothes on afterwards. So you might have Gestalt therapy, you might have the Gestalt therapy is what's going on in the here and now in the room, psychodynamic therapy about what the influences are from your past or past experiences. And I use some art therapy. So there's lots of different ways you can work. And actually what the nice thing is that I build the therapy around the individual, and I don't have a set idea of what I'm going to start with when that individual comes through the door. If that individual is, really upset because they've had a breakup with a partner, I'm not going to say, well, tell me all about your childhood. I'm going to deal with the here and now, about the feelings that have been brought up and beginning to examine them, and maybe try bring them to a logical part of the brain where you can actually start processing some of this information.
And do you feel that there is any connection between it in the way that you work between these two careers? Because it strikes me listening that you have to have a lot of confidence to be able to say, okay, I'm going to use this particular skill right now. I'm going to try this, especially when it's obviously, as all therapists are working with people's lives, with the things that they hold most dear.
Yeah, I mean, I think the two words that come to mind are radical candor. This idea of saying to people some things that nobody would ever dare say to them. And I've got a particular player at my football club who he just says, Gary, you say things to me that nobody would ever say to me. Just never. I've never heard this before. And it's that ability just to say, why are you doing that? What's really going on there? And I've come up with a formulation called the Oxford formula, which is a very simple, almost like a mathematical equation, which goes like this, that potential, and we all have potential to be different versions of ourselves, plus clinical psychotherapy, the work I do, equals success squared. And success squared is if I make somebody feel good about themselves, so they're feeling much more happier in their lives, they'll take that into other relationships in their lives, and those people will take that into their lives, and all of a sudden you've got an avalanche happening from this interaction with a clinical psychotherapist. So that's why in an ideal world, in a football club, you can turn around the fortunes of a sports organization, because you're not only working with one individual, but that individual then goes away to other individuals and feels better about themselves, or works in a more cooperative or more effective way. And all of a sudden you can turn around what appears to be not a great situation into a more positive one.
That's interesting, and it brings to mind something that I mentioned I might want to ask you about, which is the idea of service or of society. Because I think, from my understanding, that you do have quite a strong sense of a desire to provide a service to the community. And it seems to me that in a very atomized, individualized society, that sense of the benefits going outwards, rather than purely being soaked up by the individual, might be a little bit lacking.
Well, that's a really deep one, isn't it? It touches on my own spirituality, but also how I work with individuals. I'm a humanist, and I believe in the work of Carl Rogers, that we all have a chance to become better versions of ourselves. And Roger gave the example of, if you put a potato in the dark and don't give it any light and give it no nourishment, it's not going to flourish. But you put the right vegetable in the right flower bed, and you give it sunlight, and you give it the right watering and all the ideal conditions, we can grow into anything we want to do. Now, if you take that example, that metaphor, into a sports club, the possibilities are endless. And I work in schools, excuse me, with individuals, groups of individuals, churches, all sorts of people, that those changes are possible. But those people want to change. And the biggest question I always ask anybody who says, Gary would like to work with you, is, is there buy-in from the top here? Because if the management of that organization doesn't really believe in what you're doing, it's all a waste of time. So the headmaster, head teacher has to have buy-in. The head of the football club has to have buy-in. The CEO of an organization I'm working with has to have buy-in. Otherwise, they're not going to believe in my work, and it's going to be successful.
And what about a timescale? Do you think it's possible to make an impact on a client in 6 sessions, perhaps, or does a client have to invest in long-term therapy?
Well, that's how long is a piece of string question, if you don't mind me saying so. I would say that the earlier the intervention, the quicker and fewer numbers of therapy sessions are required, because by the time things get out of hand, they become systemic. They become, there might be addictive behaviors attached to that problem. So the quicker we deal with a problem, to be honest, 4 to 6 sessions is probably, it would sort it out. That's why I believe working inside a football club, by being there, we are able to see problems arising right from the very, very start. And therefore we can deal with them immediately. And a player who's presenting with a particular problem, we can resolve it fairly quickly. We don't need 10, 15, 20, 30 therapy sessions to do that. Conversely, say somebody who's in middle age and has been chronically depressed or anxious for 20 years, it's going to be longer work. Maybe you're talking about 9 months worth of work there. So it depends on the situation, depends on the individual, age of individual, what the presenting issues are.
I heard you saying somewhere something that I did think sounded very, very sort of compassionate and understanding on the wider scale of people's circumstances. That, I mean, therapy can be expensive, can't it? And over here in the UK, if you're waiting for therapy on the NHS, you can be waiting for 3 years, to the point at which it's almost not particularly useful anymore. And I did hear you saying that you do have that understanding that people's financial limitations might mean that they really do need that belt and braces thing for the time being to be able to survive.
Yes, I think that's really important. And as a therapist, I do offer low-cost clinics to people who need that. I mean, and therefore there are clients who can afford more, and there are clients who can afford less. I think that's ethically sound to be able to do that and say to certain clients, look, I know you're unwaged at the moment. We really need to think about how you're going to be able to afford this. So yes, it's a huge ethical problem all therapists come across, but I think this is just my personal view, and I'm not lecturing to anybody. It feels right to me to offer low-cost clinics to certain individuals.
And at the moment, there's a lot of talk in England, and I imagine in the US as well, about a mental health crisis. I wonder whether that's an issue of increased diagnosis or increased awareness, or if there really are problems of people finding the current societal situations too hard to handle. What's your view?
I think there's more understanding. I think people now know that they are, when they do have a mental health issue, so they're more likely to come forward than they perhaps did 15, 20 years ago. Depression, anxiety, addictive behaviors are all much better reported. It's a bit like certain elements of crime. Once people realize that it's possible to report those crimes, people do. It doesn't mean to say the world is any safer or less safer than it was 70 or 80 years ago, but those things are being reported now. So I think that I don't think we're an iller society, although there are things that I think exacerbate mental health issues, and we could go onto social media we could talk about young people, but I think it's just better reported and a better understanding, and an understanding that it's okay to come forward and say, you know, a month ago I was fine, and this month I'm not fine. You know, mental health. I think the thing that really winds me up about mental health is people think it's binary. Oh, I'm well. I'm really, really well mentally, or I'm really, really sick mentally. You know, we all have physical health issues. I've played football today and I've got sore hamstrings. Doesn't mean to say I'm ill. It just means to say I'm going to have to look after that area of my body for the next 2 or 3 days. And it's exactly the same with mental health. We have a responsibility to look after ourselves and understand that it is not a binary process. We all can be well, we all can be ill. And the truth is, like just about anything, it's a grayscale, and we're probably somewhere betwixt and between the two ends of that grayscale. There are lots of things you can do to make yourself well mentally and ensure that you don't slip down a very, very difficult road.
And what sort of things would you sort of recommend that people do personally?
Well, the usual checklist that I would do when I'm seeing a new client would be diet, exercise, socialization, how much you're looking after yourself. Sleep is a huge one. So all those sort of things you'd be checking in with somebody. How much they drink? Do they have any other addictive behaviors? Gambling? I mean, those are the things that we're looking for. But to have a good, healthy lifestyle, lots of friends, lots of good food, lots of sleep, you know, the chances are, if you're ticking those boxes, and those are regular components in your everyday life, you'll be doing okay.
And you are quite a believer in the benefits of exercise towards mood improvement, aren't you?
Yeah, I was playing football today and I just laughed for an hour. I mean, everybody was laughing as well. And, you know, that hour of laughter was probably the best piece of medicine I've had this week. It's just, it does everything. If we could bottle what goes on in our brains when we exercise, and I could sell it, I wouldn't be working anymore. I'd be sitting on my. It's there are so many positive aspects of what happens to our brains when we exercise. What gets secreted into our brains, the relaxation elements. It makes us tired. It makes us sleep better. It's just so good for you. If you are not feeling well, the first thing I would encourage you to do is go get some exercise, even if it's a 30-minute walk. The temptation, I know, is to have what we call a duvet day. Climb under the duvet and not want to see anybody, but it's not helpful. A little bit of exercise is a very, very good thing.
That was really reinforced to me when I read John Ratey's book, Spark, where he goes through all the different hormones that are released, the different effects on growth factors, as well as serotonin and dopamine and so forth. It did sound like a magic formula. Though obviously footballers who are exercising very heavily, 5, 6, sometimes 7 days a week, it's not a complete panacea, clearly.
Well, no, because if you move that into the world of professional sport, there are additional pressures that those people are under to perform in front of a live audience. Those are pressures that I am helping them to deal with, and they too can bring on their own mental health issues. So it's not quite the same, although there's I'm looking at an aspect of professional sport where those footballers are often taking caffeine stimulants, for example. I don't think people understand the absolute widespread use of caffeine supplements.
Wow.
To get people to a high, to get people slightly buzzy when they're playing professional sport, and the widespread use, and I'd say it was an endemic, the widespread use of sleeping tablets, which are unregulated in the professional game today. It's just on a scale that is extraordinary, because players have played 90 minutes of football, they're buzzy, they're excited, they have adrenaline rushing around their bodies, they have this snuff substitute which they put under their top lip. You can buy it online. They're taking caffeine. You try sleep after all that lot, it's going to be difficult.
And I certainly didn't know that, and it's my world as well, as a fellow sports broadcaster, and I truly wasn't aware of that. And David always says in these interviews, do feel free to sprinkle any anecdotes. And I know that quite a lot of the stories that would be available to you are in the public domain, because you have spoken to people openly on your show, on the Sporting Couch. Maybe you could tell me how that generated, and the benefits that you feel that has for the wider community.
Yeah. So when I started doing therapy sessions with sports people, I realized that the material coming up was so important to be heard. And of course, confidentiality means it can never be heard. It can never be disseminated on any public platform. So I went to Talk Radio and said, look, I think there are some extraordinary stories. And they said, well, I don't think you're going to find anybody who'll come clean on the radio. All right, but I tell you what, in the unlikely event you can find somebody, we'll give you an hour. So I went back to my clinic in London, which is called Cognacity, and told them about what had been said to me. And they said, we've got a guy called Duncan Bell who used to play as a prop for England. He's been very open about his mental health.
This is in rugby.
This is in rugby, yes, sorry. This is rugby union, the 15-a-side code here. Just had the Rugby World Cup final. So this chap, Duncan Bell, had his well documented struggles of depression and anxiety whilst a player. And he did this what was essentially a pilot. And we had such an unbelievable response. And I just thought, here is a chance for average people to know that there are sports people feeling exactly the same thing. Because once you realize that these huge icons, these gods of the game, these gods of sport are suffering exactly the same things that you are, it encourages people to come out. talkSPORT, which is a national radio station here in the UK, is mainly aimed at young men aged 25 to 50. And that is an area, sadly, of our demographic, which is most susceptible to suicide. And if I could just save one person, if somebody could just listen to a show and think, you know what, I'm not alone. I'm going to go seek help. I'm going to seek a counsellor. I'm going to ring the Samaritans, who are a anti-suicide helpline here in the UK. You know, if we can just save one person, you know, the whole of it is worth it. And talkSPORT were blown away by the Duncan Bell episode, and we've now recorded about 26 episodes with various sports people who've been absolutely fantastic, sharing their time and experiences on national radio, and basically saying it's okay. You know, if you do have a mental health issue, it's absolutely fine. Come and find help. It's normal.
More radical candor.
Very radical candor. The wonderful thing is I can employ my radical candor at sports people in a way I can never do as a sports broadcaster, because the people who you're interviewing after a match, after a soccer game or any sports game, would not allow you to ask the questions that as a psychotherapist I can ask.
And so what kind of issues have been brought to light in the interviews that you've done on talkSPORT?
Yeah, we've come across issues around homophobia. We've come across issues around anxiety, depression, addictive behaviors, family loss, bereavement, loss of form, homesickness. It's just about right across the board. All the things that you would expect from any psychotherapeutic interaction between a therapist and client.
I'm wondering, because you know, I come across you know, when people talk to me about my job and they hear that a player and some professional footballers have become public, either you know, because they sort of had to, because something had happened that had been reported, or they've chosen to express how they were feeling. And sometimes fans can be what you might call less than sympathetic, saying things like, how can someone who earns that much money, who has a dream job, who has a wife who looks like a model, how can they be depressed?
Yeah, I've heard this argument before. I mean, you can be the wealthiest person in the world or a pauper in the world, you can still suffer from depression and anxiety. Of course, if you are worried about money and all the things attached to money, and having enough money to be able to feed yourself or have a roof over your head, that too can induce anxiety and depression. But having enough money, all the money in the world, is not going to make you happy. I often say to clients I work with, if I just dropped £1 million into your bank account, would it make you any happier? Usually the answer is no. There's your radical camp, by the way, Izzy.
I'll take the £1 million, actually. I was...
People who are or depressed or anxious or are worried about their parents or their health or their kids, money ain't going to solve that. So that's why it doesn't make any difference what you earn. And you might be paid your highest paid player triple his wages. Is it going to make him score triple the goals? It doesn't work like that.
And as you say, there are pressures inherent in fame and that demanded high level of performance, which also must take their toll on players' psychological health. Yeah,
I think Billie Jean King, the famous tennis champion, summed it up perfectly when she said, the very famous people in the world don't understand fame, so how do you expect fans to understand fame?
When you speak to footballers or to the elite athletes on your show, are they able to, I'm sure they are able to explain what it feels like to have the pressure of the eyes of the world on them?
Well, it's it's the greatest blessing and the greatest curse. So I had a football manager in here today, just said, look, sometimes I just want to relax, kick my shoes off and go to the pub and be like everybody else. But, at the same time, he is interviewed week in and week out by the British media, and I'm afraid I'm less, not particularly sympathetic at times with people who court fame. Not suggesting sports people do court fame, but if you do court fame, especially, and you're looking to have a career in the media, and that's what you want, and you gain a lot from it, you have to take the responsibility of what comes with it. If you're a window cleaner, you might end up with, your hand might be flaky because it's in water all the time. That's the reason that you do what you do. There are implications for everything, and I think a level of maturity, if I was to try to put it a bit more succinctly, take responsibility for your actions, because if you want a life in the media, you have to accept what comes with it. It's fairly obvious what comes with it. It's not so it's a big surprise.
No. I was wondering about the crossover between the lessons that you learn, the understanding that you gain from working with people in the very sporting domain, to the private clients. And I know you work with quite a lot of adolescent boys as well, I think, don't you? And whether those two slightly different practices feed into each other and give you a kind of an enhanced or a different understanding from a psychotherapist who works purely with normal people like me and you.
The same stuff comes up. I mean, the only difference is that because I've had a background in sport and worked in sports broadcasting, I know how football clubs work. I know how the hierarchy of football clubs. But I would say the therapeutic alliance is the same in any relationship. People say, what is the tool of therapy? Well, the tool of therapy is the therapist. So it's my personality, my ability to get on with people or not get on with people, my ability to be able to make people feel at ease, my ability or lack of ability to create good relationships is what it's all about. And that doesn't matter if you're in a school or if you're in a football club. They're the same relationships. And gaining that trust from people is something that I'm sure your training will help you with. But ultimately, it's the same stuff. And there's a lot of similarities between working in schools and working in football clubs, because you are dealing with a lot of people who are very, very nervous about their role in the world and their place in the world, especially when you've got thousands of people screaming at them all the time.
You talked in one of the interviews, and I'm afraid I can't exactly remember the term, a something curve, which I think came from organisational psychotherapy, maybe, at the point at which it's good to intervene to make subtle changes when a team or an organisation is doing well. But when performance starts to fade, at that point, you don't try to change things dramatically. You go back to. I was wondering if you could just explain that, because I was wondering whether that could have parallels to the way that we are in our individual lives.
Yeah, it's called the Sigmoid Curve. It's a fairly well-known psychological um, phenomenon. And the idea is that if you are in any successful organization, be it a sports organization or a corporate organization, when you take off from wherever you're starting, a new project, maybe a new product range, maybe a run of wins, for example, if you're a soccer team or an NFL team or a NBA team, at the time when the curve is at its sharpest in your improvement, that is the time to make subtle changes, because the human psyche is such that once we realize we've mastered something, we tend to relax. And that is the point that often the curve begins to, you can see my hand here, come down. So that is the time to make subtle changes to make sure people don't relax. So I was working with a football manager a couple of weeks ago. Team are winning. I said, now's the time to make changes. He says, I don't want to make changes. And I said, why? He says, I'm superstitious. I said, this is the time to change. He did change the training regime. The players thought, what on earth's going on here? They were back on their toes again. Once you start coming down and you're unsuccessful, you should stick with what you're doing, because otherwise you're just creating something that I call a metaphor, which many football managers end up. They remind me of a bloke with tons and tons of keys on a keychain trying to find the right lock. It's just, it's just a waste of time. You're just wasting time. Will this work? 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 Well, the answer is no.
I wonder if that is applicable, because it does seem as if in one's personal life, if one was able to have that external perspective on things and say, okay, things are going okay, now's the time that I don't know, change my exercise regime or start meditating or whatever it is, because once you get to the point where things start going wrong, you're not going to improve anything for the better, really.
Well, you just said it, Izzy, perfectly. When things are going well, think about different changes you can make to your life that are positive, that are very, very positive for you. And exercise and diet and fitness and sleep are the most obvious ones.
I think I heard you say in another interview that you've recently invested in having a personal trainer, and I have one as well. And one of the things he's very I think he's as interested in mental health as he is in physical health. And he has this idea of the sort of pillars of wellness, and sleep, nutrition, and exercise for physical health. But it's kind of the same for your mental health. If you think of the nutrition as what you take in, what are you reading on social media? What people are you socializing with who are telling you, certain information or giving you certain messages? And then the exercise, are you working in a way that you're challenging yourself that little bit so that you grow? And I did find that, personally quite an interesting analogy to look at the two forms of health in parallel ways.
Yeah, once I was in a school. I'll tell a little story. I was working in a school, and they're all guzzling, and I won't say the brand name, but it was a dark fizzy liquid that's quite easy to get hold of. And
carbonated espressos.
Yes, or different coloured flavoured ones, and they're guzzling these things down. Can I have a drink, sir? Yes. And I'm saying, why are you drinking that stuff? Oh, it's cool, sir. It's cool. And I'm saying, imagine you getting hold of this brand new Porsche sports car, and you're really, really proud of this car. I said, would you put that stuff in the fuel tank? They go, why would you do that? I said, well, you're putting that stuff in your bodies, and your bodies are no better than a car for putting that stuff in a car. You're doing the damage to your bodies. It's exactly the same. So why are you actually poisoning your car when you wouldn't poison why are you poisoning your body in a way that you wouldn't poison your car? That stuff is absolutely terrible for young people.
Well, that's
probably exactly, but the idea is that you wouldn't put Coca-Cola in the fuel tank, but those kids are fueling up on that stuff all the time, or other drinks.
Well, and if you think of the sort of mental nutrition, and you mentioned social media briefly, I think young people get an awful lot of messages that can not necessarily be very helpful for them in an unstructured way of I don't know whether it's being in an echo chamber or just by the personality of groups online.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there is an echo chamber element to the whole thing. And I think young people find it very, very hard to take criticism because of the different generations and how they're coming through. It's the modern generation is called the net generation, a generation that's grown up with mobile phones from the word go. They want something, it's instant, it's there. You want a date, you can have a date within 10 minutes. You want some food, you can have a food within 20 minutes. It's this instant gratification makes it very, very hard for people just to wait and not have the instant gratification that they get. So it's quite difficult. We have a problem in sport because it means that leaders are not necessarily being created in ways that they were because of this stuff. Military, I went to have a meeting with the military. They've got exactly the same problem. And if you said to a new recruit now, do this, do that, and the other, the answer often they get back is, why would I do that? Whereas 20 years ago, they would not say that. They just do it.
No, so you've been talking that these issues in terms of leadership are happening across all these different domains.
So sport, military, the lot, they're all coming up with the same problem. My football manager says, Gary, how do you create leaders of tomorrow when these people are not keen to take on those responsibilities?
And so that's what can you do?
Well, you often end up with a manager screaming and shouting on the touchline, which to me, my job, the football team where I work, the soccer team where I work, is to create on the field leaders, what I call touchstones in the team, on the pitch, who are taking responsibility of what is going on the pitch. And conceding a goal, conceding a touchdown, conceding a basket, should be like conceding like a throw-in, anything at all. You can't be catastrophizing about what goes on inside a game. You have to say, okay, we've conceded a goal, we've conceded a touchdown or whatever, we just get on with it. But what happens often, many teams just have a meltdown. They can't cope with the disappointment. And dealing with disappointment is all about maturity, really. Many young people, many young sports people find it really, really difficult to deal with disappointment.
And so in the work that you're doing when you're helping people to deal with their personal problems away from the pitch, part of that educative process is helping people to learn to take responsibility for their lives, and that can translate into taking responsibility for their performance on the pitch as well.
Well, this is where sports psychotherapy, which is something that almost by accident I've invented, comes into its own, because what happens is I deal with people's personal problems. I deal with their ability to introspect and their ability to make sense of what's going on. And if you feel better about yourself, what happens is the byproduct of that is you'll probably be able to do your job better. If you are having a personal problem in your personal life, the chances are that will affect your working life. That's not hugely difficult to make sense of. It's fairly self-explanatory. If I'm having a personal problem, my work suffers. So if you work with sports people and you could really drill down as a psychotherapist into what is their motivation, what's going on for them, what's going on in their personal life, if we resolve it quickly, their form very, very quickly improves. And you start working with 7, 8, 9 players in the team, imagine what can happen.
And this is where it's distinct from the sports psychology as opposed to sports psychotherapy, which is more based on performance rather than a kind of holistic approach to the individual.
Exactly. So as a sports psychologist, I'll be just looking at the on-the-field performance. Sports psychotherapy is looking after the athlete. I'm not coaching the performance.
I went to the Women's World Cup in France last summer, And it was interesting how very open the women's teams were in talking about the support they had from their sports psychotherapists. And that Team USA, apparently all of the members of the team do meditation. They have, they use visual meditations of, I mean, I think someone sort of imagined herself as a big cat, as a powerful cat, and as part of her personal work, the work that she did away from the psychotherapist. And the Swedish team had an embedded psychotherapist with them all the time. And I think former German professional Birgit Prinz is a sports psychotherapist now. So within the women's game, there seems to be a lot more openness and awareness. Is that something that you've noticed?
If there were psychotherapists embedded with the women's World Cup teams in France last year, that's great. I've never heard of that. I think there'll be plenty of psychologists there, but
as opposed to psychotherapists.
Yes, exactly. So I'm sure there will have been loads of psychologists knocking around. You know, psychology has been around in the UK for 15 years. It came from the States. There was a lot of resistance to it in the UK. Sports psychotherapy is also, right at the cutting edge now, just being introduced. There's a lot of resistance to it. There's too much anxiety in football clubs here in the UK, in soccer clubs, to allow people like me, the run of the club, to speak to who I want, to hold information from so many different players, to be allowed in the dressing room right up until the kickoff, to work with people's personal problems. It's just at its very dawn here in the UK. I don't know of another psychotherapist working with first team footballers anywhere.
So these would be more sort of performance motivated rather than actually working with players on their individual problems.
And I worked with a rower, and he said it's great to talk to you, Gary. This is the first time I've ever spoken to anybody like this. He said, I've worked with a sports psychologist. And I said, oh, great. How did you get on with him or her? And he goes, he just wanted me to get back in a boat. And I'm not pleased. I think I'm being critical of sports psychologists, but that is their raison d'etre, is to look at the performance and improve the performance. It's not actually the byproduct of what they do. Might be some of the personal issues. I'm trained in really dealing with the personal issues in ways that, people say, what is psychotherapy? What is it? Well, it's in its philosophy, it's probably closer to an Eastern religion. This idea of well-being, kindness, generosity, thinking well of people, how to think imaginatively around relationships. Whereas that is not what psychology does. We are a branch of psychology. But I think we are a much more effective branch in terms of dealing with people's personal problems, and hence the byproduct is the success of the sports team.
It does sound as if there is a very much a philosophical and spiritual background to what you're saying.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think that's clear, because if you don't believe that people who you work with can be better, and ultimately, one of the hardest things to do in my training is to rip apart people's behavior in the person. I can treat somebody's behavior. To me, it's nothing to do with the person I'm dealing with. But for many people who are untrained, they just see somebody as a set of behaviors. But I'm looking at the behaviors as things that can change. It doesn't mean to say I can work with people who've done terrible, terrible things, and I do. But I see that as a behavior that is a maladaptive behavior to something that's not quite right in their life. All our behaviors are there as a result of a way of defending difficult feelings. We deal with those difficult feelings, those maladaptive behaviors tend to change.
It sounds very compassionate, and also that hope for redemption, I would imagine, is very empowering for your clients, but also beneficial for you as the practitioner.
Well, we all struggle as therapists thinking why we do this, but when you see an individual who's gone through terrible turmoil coming out the other end, and you've held their hand metaphorically through that process, it's immensely rewarding. The wonderful thing about being a sports psychotherapist is it's there every week. The team win, and they, you talk to some of the players, and they say, you've made a big difference to what I was feeling about my game or how I feel about myself. It's a very, very heady feeling, but I have to remember that I don't want to get carried away by taking the credit of sporting success, because I know that if sporting failure is just on the other side of the same coin. So my job is to assist the first team manager, the first team strength and conditioning staff, the head of medicine at the club, all those people. We are part of one big group working together, trying to create sporting success.
And how would you advise people who might be interested in following this kind of career path? They might not have the advantage of having been a top-level sports broadcaster to start with, though.
Well, I'm going to give a shameless plug. We're going to have our first ever sports psychotherapy conference here in Oxford in February, when for the first time we will look at some of these issues. We'll get some leading lights from the field. So it's coming. It is definitely coming. I would say to any psychotherapist who has an interest in sport, this is a field that is growing. Feel free to get in contact with me. I'm happy to give details, but this is an exciting, really exciting way of looking at sport and making a difference. Can you imagine sitting in the stands watching a sports game, thinking, that person, whatever's going on, is feeling better about themselves, win, lose, or draw.
That sounds wonderful, and it sounds a great place to wrap it up. We'll make sure that your details are there on the show notes, and I, for one, will try to make it to that conference in February in Oxford. So, Gary, thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for being on Shrink Wrap Radio.
My pleasure. Good to speak to you, Izzy.
Well, I certainly learnt a lot from that interview with Gary Bloom. It was clear from my question about the Women's World Cup that I hadn't entirely taken on board the uniqueness of his approach. Gary explained very clearly the difference between sports psychology, which considers performance, and sports psychotherapy, which takes a far more holistic approach, considering the life experience, the personal life of the player, as well as their performance on the pitch. If we expand that concept, as he explained, the improvement in the player generates improved performance within the team, the organisation, or the school. And expanding that concept, one could see how it would function in the same way with a family, a community, even perhaps a nation, and that's certainly food for thought. After I stopped recording, Gary explained to me a little bit of the way in which he works. He said he's at the training ground along with the management team and the players. He might go up to someone and say, "How are you doing?" And they might say, "Well, Gaz, I don't feel that I played very well last night, and some things are getting on top of me." And that kind of informal approach seems to breed a lot of trust, generates a respectful and communicative atmosphere between the psychotherapist and the individual. In an environment, a macho world, where any sign of emotion or vulnerability could be seen as weakness, that certainly seems to be a good way in. I was equally impressed by the way in which Gary feels that his show, On the Sporting Couch, might help to alleviate some of the constraints upon young men particularly, who feel that they can't express their mental problems. As he said, if just one life can be saved, it's well worth it.